Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro's father-in-law, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness, and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him, in the flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight. When the Lord saw that he has gone over, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of the people in Egypt. I am concerned about their suffering, so I have come down to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of the land into good and spacious land flowing with milk and honey. So now go, I am sending you to the Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you.
Well, good morning, everyone. So, I have a huge announcement to make. Little League Baseball is over. Yay! No more practices and long days in the sun. No, we had fun. Megan had fun, but this is it. And today is their end of the year party, and they're going to a thing today. And Megan was trying to tell one of his friends earlier. It was kind of funny. He said, we're going to play. He said, it's like baseball, but the coach rolls the ball to you, and then you kick it, and then you run around the bases. And then the guy says, you mean like kickball? He says, yeah, that's it. That's what we're playing. So anyway, he's excited about that, and I'm excited to be done. We're definitely getting close to the end of the year. How many of you have kids in school that are already basically feeling like they're done with school for the year? Yeah. Now, we have been doing for a few weeks now, we've been in this series we are calling The Story. The story is, of course, this thing that we have started where we are going through the entire Bible in 31 weeks, which means we have rather large sections to cover each week. But we're familiarizing ourselves not just with the stories like we would hear in Sunday school or in other kinds of classes you may have been to when you were younger, but we are hearing the story about the two main characters of God and humanity, how they lost each other through the conflict of sin, and how eventually through the pages of history, God was going to build a nation, birth a Messiah, and unite those two main characters together again. Reclaim the humanity he lost. Last week, we talked through the story of Joseph and how much of his life we saw that God was faithful in the bad things in order to ultimately use him for his grand plan. By the end of last week, we had a family of Joseph's family living in the nation of Egypt. And from there, their lives were saved, but they're all living there. So how do we get from a small group of people living in Egypt to a whole nation of people living in slavery? And that's a fascinating story. But you see, between the pages of Genesis chapter 50 and Exodus chapter 1, about 400 years have passed. And that little group of people grew into a rather significant group of people. And now these Hebrews live among the Egyptians. And because they've grown so much, and because Joseph is now so much history, they begin to be seen as a threat. And when they're seen as a threat, Pharaoh decides that they need to become slaves so they can keep them subjugated to things. And so they treat them harshly, and they make them do things. And all this stuff is happening, and Pharaoh continues to build it on them. And they're living in slavery in Egypt, a long way from the nation God was going to build and his plan. But the way in which we move from that moment until the story of Moses and the nation that's coming is really remarkable. God takes them at a pivotal moment and uses a pivotal man to change everything and launch into the next big step in the story. So, we're going to get into that one, that part of the story. Now, the way I want to kind of focus and organize this, because there's so much to take on, is I want you to jump ahead a little bit to the point in which a guy named Moses, who is an old shepherd at this point, is wandering through the wilderness, and he's shepherding his sheep, and he ends up on top of a little mountain, and he sees this bush, okay? He sees this bush, and it's burning. There's a fire in it. And yet, after a while, he realizes that the bush isn't actually burning down. It just keeps going and going. It's not like it needs to be filled with more wood. It's just not being consumed. This is curious enough that he takes a few steps. He goes over toward it to check it out and see what's going on. And in that moment, his life changes forever. And not only that, but the life and the history of Israel would change forever. Because out of that bush, God spoke and called him to become the one that would lead that nation out of Egypt and into the land he originally promised to the forefathers. That moment is incredibly important. But what's also interesting is Moses' reaction. Moses gets the call of a lifetime, let me tell you. And he follows it up with really 3 questions. And these 3 questions are interesting and significant. The first thing he says is, who am I that I should be the one to do this job? And God, of course, tells them it's not about you, it's about me. And they says, well, okay, who are you? And, really what he says, what he actually says is, if they should ask me who sent me, who shall I tell them? But being that he came out of Egypt, he may really be needing a little bit more specificity, a little bit more direction. What is your name, God? Is the essence of the question. And then once they've covered those 2 things, he kind of throws out in the third one, and what if they don't believe me? Which I think is a really good question, right? If you're going to go running back and tell everyone, hey, I was talking to this burning bush the other day, and God wants me to lead you out of here, they might have a few questions, right? So he comes with these 3 questions. And what I want to do, in order to kind of break down this story, is to be totally honest with you, we don't have time to do it step by step the way that I would like to, okay? I don't know if you noticed, but we've been running a little long the last couple of weeks. So here's the way I want to break it down. I want to take these 3 questions and I want to go through them. I want to talk about what we learn about Moses. I want to talk about what we learn about God. And then I want to talk about the what if they don't believe me part. Because I think those 3 questions will break down the story as a whole pretty well. So who am I? Well, Moses. So let's take on what do we learn about Moses through this story? Okay, let's start with his birth. Many of you may have heard some of these stories. I'll try to tell them quickly as we go through. But essentially, by this point, Israel is living in slavery under a new Pharaoh. There are a lot of people, and they're seen as a threat. And they continue to grow even under that threat, even under the fact that they are slaves. They are just booming in population. And so Pharaoh declares that all of the babies born, well, those that are boys, should what? Perish. They're going to get rid of all the boys. This will allow them not to multiply so much, not to have later military-age males that can fight them. This is to keep them subjugated. And so we have this problem. And in the middle of that mess, Moses is born of this little tiny Hebrew baby. Now his mom, being a bit of a rebel, hides him. Keeps him hidden as long as she possibly can to try to keep him alive. And then finally, when she really can't keep him hidden anymore, she puts him in a basket and lays him down among the reeds on the Nile River. It's not clear what her goal was. Maybe it was just to hide him for a little while. Maybe it was just to see what would happen. It's not necessary that he was necessarily going down the river very fast, especially if there are all these reeds and things. But he's sort of hiding there in the bushes, and they're keeping an eye on what's happening. Well, sure enough, at this point, Pharaoh has a daughter who comes out, and as they would in those day and age, bathe in the river, and she finds something. And it's just like when your kids are out playing in the neighborhood, and this dog comes up to them, and then they come home, and what do they say to Mom? Hey, Mom, can we keep it? I'm sorry, but that's the way the story seems to be told. So Pharaoh's daughter finds this little Hebrew baby and says, hey, Daddy, can we keep him? Now, because she's Pharaoh's daughter, I assume she gets a little leeway in these things. And so they say yes. And what's really clever is that Moses' sister, who's obviously a bit older, has been keeping an eye on this whole situation. And so she offers to Pharaoh's daughter there, says, hey, I can find you a good Hebrew wet nurse who can come and nurse your baby. And she says, yeah, that's a great idea. And who do they come up with and bring to be the wet nurse? Moses' own mother. So Moses grows up in this really interesting environment where he's Pharaoh's daughter and yet obviously a Hebrew. And he grows up with this sort of dual understanding, almost like dual citizenship. He's in a strange place. But I think that because he was familiar with both the Hebrew world and the royal Egyptian family, he might have been rather well prepared for the job he was going to do. Then you get further into Moses' story, and he grows up, right? And as he grows up, we find out that he also has this sense of injustice. Now, the first part of the story doesn't sound very good, but it is part of telling us that he has this sense of injustice. He's beginning to identify with the Hebrew side of himself. You see, one day he's wandering in the markets in the cities, and he sees an Egyptian slave master beating on his Hebrew slave. And Moses, being that he has this sense of injustice and the fact that he is at least Hebrew, he gets in the middle of the fight, he tries to stop it, and he ends up killing the Egyptian master. This is unfortunate. I don't know if this is the way it should have gone. I certainly don't think that the Bible is prescribing this, but we get a sense of who Moses is. Later on, he comes back. He sees two Israelites, or two Hebrews fighting, and he tries to stop them. He gets in the middle of that one, and then one of them makes a smart remark like, hey, are you going to kill me like you did that other guy? And suddenly he realizes that his action is known, which leaves Moses to flee. There's also one other event that gives us the idea of his sense of injustice. Later on, as he is in the wilderness now, a fugitive, he sees 7 daughters of a priest, and they're getting water at a well. And all of a sudden, these other shepherds come by, and they're like, ooh, we need the water. You guys need to go. And because they're the guys, they sort of, rush them off. Moses sees this, and what does he do? He steps in, he intervenes, and he makes sure that they get their water. So now we've got this man who is a fugitive living off in the wilderness, a man who has strangely a Hebrew bloodline, but experience in the royal family, and who has this sense of injustice and seems to identify with his Hebrew roots more than his Egyptian raising. He is, in many ways, a combination of the exact traits needed for God to use for this task coming up. And that's what we know about Moses. That's the who am I portion. So let's now jump to the and who are you portion. That is, what do we learn about God in these stories? And there's a number of really good and interesting things. The first and foremost, what I think matters is that we learn from this how much God cares about his people. As they're living in slavery, he doesn't miss it. Jumping now into Exodus 3 and verse 7. This is Moses now on the mountain God on the mountain speaking to Moses, and a really interesting conversation happens. Verse 7, the Lord said to Moses, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. Do any of you find that comforting? 400 years have passed, and yet God still hears their cry, understands their pain and their suffering. What you've gone through, the tears you've cried, they are not in vain. There is a God who hears them. And though he may not always act immediately or in the way that you want, 400 years have passed, and he hears their cry, and he responds by sending them this man. God cares, and the promises he has made still matter. 400 years has not stopped him from caring. And I think that really matters. Go on to verse 8. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up out of that land and into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the, and now if you're okay with it, I just put in brackets nations, because then I would take up an entire slide just to say the names of all the nations, okay? This is the part where it's like the land of the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Hephathites and the Beluzzites, and I'm just making things up, but there's so many names in there, right? You remember that. So I just put nations. But he's telling them this news, that we are going to rescue them and bring them to the promised land. Verse 9, and now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them, and so now I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And at that point, I think Moses is a bit taken aback, like, what? Me? I think I would too. The second thing we find out about God in this story is that God is given an actual name. Like for real. When Moses says, who are you? Who shall I say sent me? There's this mysterious part where God gives him a name. Exodus chapter 3, verse 13. We're jumping forward just a little bit. Remember how important names are in the Old Testament. They mean a lot with regard to Abraham, with regard to Jacob. Each of them have all this meaning, right? So Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? And so God does something, and it's really interesting and really fascinating, honestly, kind of mysterious. Verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. Go on to verse 15. Let's just make sure we go through all of this. God said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, which is how the NIV puts that name, the Lord The God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation." Okay, Moses asks him, "And what name should I give?" And God surprisingly gives him one. And it's very mysterious, it's very odd. It doesn't make a lot of sense to say, "I am sent me." Right? Like just in regular English, that doesn't even sound right, right? And there's a reason for that. I think there's a point to it. It's mysterious in a lot of ways. In Hebrew, this name is only 4 letters. In ancient Hebrew, you may or may not realize this, in ancient Hebrew, there were no vowels. So it's just a series of consonants. And how you transliterate them and how you would pronounce them are up for debate. In fact, we're still debating it to this day, okay? No one knows for sure how to pronounce these mysterious 4 letters. In the ancient world, they got to the point where they were not allowed to say it anymore. And so when the ancient scribes would read from the text and they got to the holy name, they simply said Adonai instead of the holy name. And so no one really knows how to pronounce it. What we do know is that these 4 letters appear to be related to the verb to be, which of course in first person is I am. Now this is strange, right? To call yourself the I am, to say I am to be, and simply leave it there doesn't sound like a sentence. It doesn't sound like it means anything. And yet we think it does have a couple important implications. So for one, it might indicate or describe the timelessness of God. So when you say to be, that is forever and eternally present tense. It's not that there was ever a time when you were, you simply are. And then beyond you are, it could also mean you will be. It means I am and I forever will be. And so God's timelessness is built into this description. God never was, He always is, and He always will be. He's saying, I am the eternal one in essence. That's part of it. Wow, we got a storm right as I'm describing the name of God. I'm getting a little spooked. Okay, all right. Figure I might as well acknowledge the obvious. You guys are all looking around like, what's going on here? Zero in, all right? I'm trying to get through this faster, and now you guys are distracting me. The 4 letters, the holy name, the to be, He's saying, I am timeless. I am forever present tense. I never was. I also think that in a very real way, it draws to mind God's singular nature. It's like He's saying, I am. There are 2 categories. There's me, and then there's everything else. There's God, and then there's not God. And those are the 2 biggest distinguishing marks in all of history. Those are the 2 categories of the universe. From a philosophical, ontological way, there's God and not God. I am, and you are something else. I think there's something profound about it that He's trying to say. I am has sent you. Also, there's no need for me to give you a name beyond I am, because there are no other gods that can do what I do. I am set apart. I am different. There is my category and there's everything else. Do not confuse me with an Egyptian god. Do not confuse me with another people's god. I am God, and I am the only one. I am singular and unique, and I am my own category. I think that's part of it. And so this mysterious name says a lot. Now, for those of you who may have heard that there are some controversies out there about the holy name and how to say it and what's the right one, and you know, obviously, there are groups that are very stringent that it has to say Jehovah, and that is the only proper name, and anything else you say is wrong, right? Let me just tell you a couple of things. Because we don't have the vowels, and because they didn't pronounce it for centuries, if not millennia, no one knows exactly how to say it. Even people who argue these things. Secondly, what I will say is that I don't think it's as important as some people make it out to be. It wasn't pronounced for centuries, and if God really wanted us to know, He would have really told us, okay? So don't get caught up in it. That's what I'm saying. The two most common pronunciations at this point are Jehovah and Yahweh. You'll probably hear one or the other because those are kind of the two big schools of thought, okay? But don't get caught up in it. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, so let's move on. We've learned about God, one, that he cares about his people tremendously. He has not forgotten them after 400 years. He heard their cries and he acted. Number two, we got his holy name, describing his timelessness and his set-apart singular nature. Now, the third thing that we learn from these stories of Moses is God's power. And boy, let me tell you, we learned that a lot. Over and over, we learn about how powerful God is. Because think about it. He's taking a people who are subjugated to slavery and bringing them up out of that land into their own land as his own nation and doing it without a single battle being fought. He better show his power in remarkable ways, and he does. So first of all, as you kind of know this, you may know the story to some degree. There's been a lot of movies and songs and plays and a million things about this because it's an incredibly universal and appealing story. But here's the thing. Moses goes to Pharaoh, says, hey, let my people go. Right, okay. And Pharaoh says, no. And so God acts. And what happens that moves us beyond that is what we call the 10 plagues. This is where God shows his power to Egypt in incredibly powerful ways. And he does these plagues that fall upon Egypt, and punishes them to sort of convince them, hey, just so you know, I'm powerful enough to destroy you. And one after another of these plagues falls upon Egypt, and in each one of them, it distinguishes between the Egyptians and the Israelites. The first of the plagues is that it turns all the water of the Nile River into blood, which I imagine leads to a lot of issues. From there, frogs pop up and go all over the place and make life miserable. And then gnats, and then flies, and then disease breaks out among the livestock and kills them. And then boils break out on the body of the people, and they're miserable and sick. And then hail falls on the land and destroys all of their crops. And then what is left, locusts come up and eat all the wood that it remains. And then finally, there's darkness in the land for 3 whole days. A couple of times, Pharaoh says to Moses, hey, we'll let you go. We're done here, okay? We'll let you go, but, just make this stop. And then Moses would talk to God, and then God would make it stop, and then Pharaoh would go, oh, wait, never mind. And then God would bring another plague, and he'd do the same thing as this song and dance. But over and over, what we're really seeing is his power. And if I can make a little bit further point of this, because it does matter, there's a theory out there that you may not realize this theory. There's a theory out there that each of the 10 plagues was chosen for a very specific purpose. There's a theory that says that each one of them is modeled to take on the jurisdiction of some other Egyptian god. As if, the darkness rejects the power of the sun god. The crops being destroyed rejects some of their fertility gods and things like that. Each one of them is meant to combat or demonstrate God's superiority over an Egyptian god. If that's the case, then every one of these is a proclamation to God's unique power. Egyptians have many gods responsible for particular aspects, for the Hebrews have one God who is more powerful than all of them combined. Does that make sense? And so we get a proclamation of God's power happening through the stories of the plagues. Then, of course, you probably know that the last plague was the worst. It was the one in which the firstborn son of all the Egyptians died. And it was a tremendously horrific night. And God knew that that would be the moment that they would finally let the Israelites go. And so he had them prepare. And this was the basis of the Passover. that night when the angel of death came and took the firstborn son of all the houses, they were instructed to offer a sacrifice and to put the blood on the doorways of their houses, and the angel of death would know not to go into the Israelite houses. Those who had faith, who had the symbol of blood on their doorway, would not receive that punishment. We're going to come back to that, but that's part of the story. And what's really amazing is that is the moment that not only do they tell the Israelites, okay, go, leave us, we are tired of these plagues. They honestly say, take everything we have with you. You want gold, we got it. You want clothes, take it. You want cattle, here, it's all yours. This is called the plunder of the Egyptians. Not only were they begged to leave, they gave them everything they could to get them out faster. If you want to talk about a powerful God, that matters. It's amazing what happened. We go a little bit further, and as they're running away and they're out in the wilderness and they've gotten a ways now, you probably know that Pharaoh, who had a tendency to change his mind one last time, and he sends an army with chariots and everything out to get them. And there's this moment, and this is pop culture. I mean, most everyone has seen this moment. But there's the moment where there's the Red Sea on one side and the army on the other, and they're trapped and they don't know what to do, and they're crying out to God for help. Actually, they're crying out to Moses, saying, hey, why'd you leave us here just to die? You're going to hear that again. But they're trapped. And Moses cries out to God, and what does he do in that incredible moment? He raises his staff up, and who's the guy from the movie? What's his name? Charlton Heston, thank you. I knew that. Charlton Heston raises up his staff, and what happens? The sea parts. Talk about a proclamation of God's power, right? In that moment, the Israelites walk through on dry land, and after they get through, the Egyptians are right on their tail. They're running up, and what happens? The water comes back together and essentially drowns the army. God protects them in a moment which they felt truly trapped. His power is on display, and it's an incredible moment. So we have the plagues, we have the parting of the Red Sea. How about their provisions through the desert? Do you see God's power in that? Like the fact that at night there was a ball of fire that would lead them where they were supposed to go. And in the day there would be this pillar of cloud that would lead them where they were supposed to go. And when they wanted meat, God sent the wind such that a group of quail landed where they needed to be to give them meat. And when they wanted bread and something to eat, God literally rained down bread from heaven to provide their needs every single day. And when they were thirsty and in the wilderness and the desert, that matters, God provided for them through what? Do you guys remember this? Well, I'm sorry, the water, when they were thirsty. A rock struck the rock and water flowed out of it. You know, one of the things that I heard in Bible college is this is the period in which the most miracles, the most dense miracle time in Israel's history. You know, here they have been living under Egyptian rule for 400 years. Some of them have probably come to believe in the Egyptian gods. And all of a sudden, this God, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, comes in. He strikes down every one of the Egyptian gods through the 10 plagues, showing how weak and useless they are. And then he leads them literally through miraculous means that they could visualize and see every day, with a pillar of cloud in the sky and fire at night. And then he provides for their everyday needs miraculously every day. Bread coming down from heaven, water flowing out of a rock. This is the most dense season of miracles in all of the Bible. They should get the message of the power of God on that alone. It's unbelievable. And if nothing else, we should see God's power in the miracle he performed, in the very fact that he was so zealous for this people, that he rescued them out of slavery without a war, without really even a single battle. He brought them out against all odds in a way that no one had ever heard of. He filled their everyday experiences with miracle after miracle after miracle. And when he did, he said, "My zeal for you is so great, I am claiming you and you alone as my people. You are mine, and you will trust me and me only." And we'll see how well that goes. But the point of God doing all of this, remember, is the bigger picture of the story itself. I'm building a nation, and through that nation, I am rescuing humanity. And in order for that to happen, I've got to be different than every other God you ever heard of. And this people has to be mine and only mine. And his zeal for the people overflows in every single page of this part of the story. And it's unbelievable. This is where God not only tells them who he is, but in a great sense, he's telling all of us who he is as well. This is my power. This is what I do for my people. And that's the incredible miracle of this part. But I want to do that one last question. You remember our 3 questions? Who am I? Who are you? And what was that last part? What if they don't believe me? Now, the immediate answer to that question is that God gives him several miraculous signs, most of which have to do with his staff. Moses takes out his staff and throws it on the ground, and it turns into a snake. And then God says, "Put your hand into your tunic and pull it out," and it comes out, and it's leprous. It's got disease on it. And then, of course, he heals it back immediately. But the point of this is he gives them these signs. But I want to take this in a little bit different direction, because we now live also on a mission. God has at some point gotten our attention with some sort of a burning bush in our life and been called now to live in a different way, in a different purpose with a mission. It may not be to bring his people out of slavery to Egypt, but it is to bring others out of slavery to their own sins. In many ways, we have heard that calling from God, and like Moses, we are out there trying to bring people to a faith in the same Jesus we believe in. We are also on mission. And here's our question: God, what if they don't believe me about Jesus? What if they don't like what I have to say? What if they roll their eyes and scoff at me? What am I supposed to do, God? Well, I will say this: I don't recommend throwing your staff on the ground and turning it into a snake. But here's what I do want to say. In many ways in this story, we not only learn about Moses and God, but we also learn about Jesus. And I know that sounds strange to say in the Old Testament, but I want to point out a few things to you, because I do think that the answer to the question of how are they going to believe me comes from knowing this story and how incredibly it's been built and what God has done. Number one, Matthew portrays Jesus as a bit like a second Moses. If you've ever read the beginning of Matthew, you can see the parallels. Jesus, when he is threatened to kill all the baby boys, and who was that? Not Pharaoh, but who else threatened to kill all the baby boys? King Herod. He then flees to what part of the world for briefly? Egypt. Baby Jesus flees to Egypt. And he comes back after Herod's death, just like the Israelites return to the promised land. If you know, later in the story, Moses is going to go up on a mountain for 40 days and 40 nights and come down carrying what? The stone tablets, the 10 Commandments. Jesus goes into the wilderness for how long? 40 days and 40 nights before his ministry begins, and he comes out of there and immediately delivers the Sermon on the Mount, which takes the 10 Commandments and other aspects of the law and repurposes them in light of the kingdom. You've heard that it was said, "Do not murder," but I tell you, do not anger. You've heard that it was said, "You should not commit adultery," but I tell you, do not lust. And over again, he is sort of recommissioning the 10 Commandments to the people. Matthew is very intentional to display Jesus as a second Moses. You want to believe in Jesus? See the power of the story of what God is doing. If you want to believe in Jesus, go back to that Passover lamb thing. Remember when they sacrificed something and put the blood on the doorway of their houses, where something else got sacrificed for their own sins in order to save them from their slavery to something else. When God saw the blood and rescued them from the sure death that they deserved, that happened to us in our being set free from slavery to sin through a sacrifice, the Passover lamb. And when he told them to eat a meal, to remember that moment year after year after year, calling it the Passover, the Seder meal, that then was repeated in the New Testament in the idea of communion, when we were commanded to do this every week and remember. Or think about the Gospel of John. John famously has 7 or 8, I think 7 I am statements. I am the bread from heaven. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the living water that flows. And where does that come from? From that holy name, I am the I am. Over and over again, it's used now to tell the story of Jesus years later. Of course, the whole delivery from slavery into a promised land is an unbelievable parallel to our own being set free from slavery to sin. This is an all-consuming parable of overcoming bad odds, of people who were oppressed, now coming into a greater reality, a new promised land. This is why the story is so loved, why there's so many renditions of this story, because the idea of a people being subjugated to something, now being set free from something, is a universal concept, and its most famous iteration is in Jesus Christ and our being set free from slavery to sin. This story is beloved by the oppressed and feared by the oppressors. This is a story of new life, and it's incredible. How about the fact that through this story we see the faithfulness of God and His promises and the irrelevance of time past? I told you that between Genesis and Exodus, about 400 years passed. What about between the Old Testament and the New? Malachi and Matthew, how many years have passed? About 400. And God speaks again and commissions a new Moses in Jesus, who far exceeds the previous one. Once again, time is irrelevant. God hears the cries of His people and acts. He acts for you and He acts for me. He's still in it. And these rescue missions are something we can always go back to and see that our God remains good. The answer to the question, what if they don't believe me? Tell them as a story again. Tell them how God repeats His actions and His loves and miraculously does this through prophecy, the repetition of action, through symbols and foreshadowing. The story tells itself. What happens at the beginning comes true in the later parts. And that can only be done miraculously because history doesn't slow down, but only God writes the story that well. The best evidence for the faith is the story itself. That's how you answer the question, what if they don't believe me? Last but not least, let's do our application points. It's hard because so much of this is narrative and telling the story, but we need to apply what we've heard, not just a new understanding, but in our life. The first and easiest thing I'll tell you is I'll remind you that next week we have a guest speaker, and so we won't be doing the story next week. So this would be a great opportunity to go back and review whatever you may have missed or didn't have time to really look at as much as you wanted to. You've got 4 weeks. That's very reasonable. Go back through the lessons, maybe even the Bible stories themselves, review what you've heard, and we'll have a week to sort of wrap our minds around it before we move on. So I'd say go back and you do that. But the second thing, and this is an important one, and it's personal to me, I'll say this. Never feel unqualified for what God has truly called you to do. Now, if you That doesn't mean that every one of you needs to become a preacher, Maybe God didn't call you to that. But if he did call you to it, then he will, in fact, give you the ability and the qualifications to do it. I know this in my life. I spent years, in some sense, I'd almost say wasting my time in school, trying to figure out what I wanted to do, only to come back to the idea that I could be a preacher, because honestly, I didn't believe God enough at the beginning. I didn't think he could use me to do it. I didn't think I had the right personality. I didn't think I fit. But I came under an understanding that God could use me as I was and transform me into who he needed me to be. And for me, that lesson that I could become God's servant meant a lot. And I just want you to know that if God has called you to do it, he will prepare you to do it. And the reason I tell that now is go to Exodus 4. And I'll bring the story on the mountain to a close here. After Moses asks his 3 questions, he has 2 more comments. The first one is here. Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant." In other words, I'm fumbling right now. I am slow of speech and tongue. Now, God encourages him and says, "No, you're going to be okay. You can handle this." Verse 11, the Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. I will make it possible for you." Later, the second question he says, the same comment he makes is, "Lord, please send someone else." And it's kind of funny because he doesn't believe he can do it, and he's not yet trusting God enough to fill in the gaps. And so he says, "God, please send someone else." And it actually says there that God was a little angry with him because he didn't believe that God could fill in the gap. No, Moses, come on. And that's when he gives him his brother Aaron to help with the speaking part. But God was just a little bit mad because he didn't want to accept the calling. And I understand why Moses didn't want to. I get it. But maybe in our lives, if we are refusing to do what God has called us to do because we don't think we can, maybe we're just lacking in faith that God can fill in the gap. And maybe God is just a little disappointed that we haven't believed him yet. When God calls you to do something, act on it. He can make you able to do it. We'll end with that today. We will pick up in 2 weeks, and we'll get into chapter 5. If you will, bow your heads. God, I thank you for this story. I pray that you continue to use it to reinvigorate our faith, to remind us and to help us to make sense maybe of the variety of things we've heard and how they come together. May this be something we can use to evangelize. Once we know the story, we can live more fully in how we fit into the story. I pray, Lord, that all of this just is something you are working on through your Holy Spirit in our hearts and lives, transforming us into the church you want us to be. And it's in your Son's precious name we pray. Amen.